On April 30th, 1945, in a concrete bunker beneath Berlin, a 22-year-old woman named Traudl Junge sat at a typewriter and began typing Adolf Hitler's last will and testament. Hours later, she would hear a gunshot from Hitler's study. The man she had served loyally for 2.5 years was dead. She would spend the next 57 years trying to understand how she, an ordinary young woman with dreams of becoming a ballerina, had ended up working for history's greatest mass murderer. Her story and those of Hitler's other secretaries reveal an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and a pitchfork. Sometimes it comes with polite manners, afternoon tea, and a fatherly smile. Hitler employed several personal secretaries throughout his time in power, but 4 women stand out as his closest and longest-serving: Johanna Wolf, Christa Schroeder, Gerda Christian, and Traudl Junge. These women saw Hitler almost daily, ate meals with him, traveled with him to various headquarters, and worked in his immediate vicinity for years. They typed his correspondence, took dictation for his speeches, managed his schedule, and became part of his inner circle. What happened to them after the war ended reveals a complex story of denial, reckoning, silence, and in some cases, genuine remorse. Their fates varied dramatically, shaped by their ages, personalities, and willingness to confront what they had been part of. Johanna Wolf was Hitler's oldest and longest-serving secretary. Born on June 1st, 1900, in Munich, she joined Hitler's personal secretariat in autumn 1929 as a typist, also becoming a Nazi Party member at that time. Prior to 1933, she performed secretarial work for Rudolf Hess and Wilhelm Bruckner, who was Hitler's chief adjutant. When Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, Wolf became a senior secretary in his private chancellery. She was widely regarded as the most authoritative and comprehensive resource for information about Hitler. While Hitler addressed his other secretaries formally as Frau or Fräulein, he called Wolf Wolfin, meaning she-wolf, because of his obsession with wolves. This nickname reflected the close relationship they shared. Wolf was a dedicated Nazi and a trusted member of Hitler's entourage, though she was often ill and her work rate was sometimes questioned. However, nobody could do anything about it since Hitler personally protected her. Wolf lived at the Wolfschanz or Wolf's Lair near Rassenburg, Adolf Hitler's World War II Eastern Front military headquarters, from 1941 until he and his staff departed for the last time on November 20th, 1944. When Hitler withdrew his headquarters to the Führer bunker in Berlin in January 1945, she went with him and his staff. Before late April 1945, Hitler would regularly have lunch with Wolf and fellow Secretary Christa Schroeder. On the night of April 21st to 22nd, 1945, Hitler, having decided to stay and die in Berlin, ordered Wolf and Schroeder to leave by aircraft for the Obersalzberg. Wolf was so loyal to Hitler that she wanted to die with him in the Führer bunker, but she departed because Hitler urged her to leave for the sake of her 80-year-old mother. He forced her and others to leave on the last flights out of Berlin. Wolf stayed at Berchtesgaden until May 2nd and then traveled to her mother's residence in Bad Tolz. She was arrested and taken prisoner on May 23rd in Bad Tolz by American troops. Together with Schroeder, Wolf remained a prisoner until January 14th, 1948. During her imprisonment, American and Allied interrogators repeatedly questioned her about Hitler and events in the Führer bunker. She was called to testify at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, where photographs show her practicing English with Ingeborg Speer, Rudolf Hess's former secretary, while waiting to give testimony. After her release in 1948, Wolf moved to Kaufbeuren and remained friends with other members of Hitler's inner circle, including his pilot Hans Bauer, his adjutant Otto Gunsch, and fellow secretaries Christa Schroeder and Traudl Junge. What makes Johanna Wolf's story particularly striking is her absolute refusal to speak about Hitler publicly. Unlike other secretaries, such as Traudl Junge and Christa Schroeder, Wolf refused to consent to any interviews or reveal any information, even during the 1970s when she was offered large sums of money to write her memoirs. Whenever asked to do so, Wolf stated that she was a private secretary and believed it was her duty never to reveal anything about Hitler. This silence lasted her entire life. She told German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl that people close to Hitler were not able to escape his magnetism until his death, even though he was quite emaciated near the end. She also claimed that Hitler was not aware of all the terrible things that were happening in Germany during his period of office and blamed others such as Heinrich Himmler for the atrocities. Johanna Wolf died in Munich on June 5, 1985, at the age of 85. She never married and took her secrets to the grave, maintaining her loyalty to Hitler and her oath of secrecy until the very end. Christa Schroeder, born Emily Christine Schroeder on March 19, 1908, in Hannover-Schmünden, had a very different relationship with her past than Johanna Wolf. After her parents died, she moved to Nagold, where she worked for a lawyer from 1929 to March 1930. After leaving Nagold for Munich, Schroeder was employed as a shorthand typist in the Oberste Hesse-Führung, the Sturmabteilung High Command. There she met Adolf Hitler in early 1933 when he had just been appointed chancellor. He took a liking to Schroeder and hired her in June 1933. She would work as one of his personal secretaries for the next 12 years. Schroeder was an accomplished stenotypist, even winning awards for her shorthand abilities. She officially joined the Nazi Party to keep her job, later claiming she had no interest in politics. Schroeder lived at the Wolfschanz from 1941 until November 20, 1944, when Hitler and his staff departed for the last time. When Hitler withdrew to the Führerbunker in Berlin in January 1945, she went with him. Hitler became very dependent on Schroeder over the years. In 1938, she became engaged to Yugoslav diplomat Lav Alkonik. When Hitler refused to give his blessing to the liaison, Schroeder raised the possibility of leaving his employment. Hitler replied ominously, "I would know how to prevent that." To protect Alkonik, she broke off the engagement. A friend later commented that this decision would cause her emotional stress for the rest of her life. Before late April 1945, Hitler would regularly have lunch with Schroeder and Johanna Wolf. On April 20th, 1945, during the Battle of Berlin and coinciding with Hitler's 56th birthday, Schroeder, Wolf, Albert Bormann, Admiral Karl Jesko von Puttkamer, Dr. Theodor Morell, Dr. Hugo Blaschke, and 6 shorthand typists were ordered by Hitler to leave Berlin by aircraft for the Obersalzberg. The group flew out of Berlin on different flights over the following 3 days. She was arrested on May 28, 1945, in Hintersee near Berchtesgaden. Schroeder was interrogated by French liaison officer Albert Zoller, serving in the 7th U.S. Army. An American intelligence report from May 22, 1945, stated that the interrogator found her rather stupid, dumpy, and an ardent Nazi. Schroeder later recalled that after the interrogation was over, the lieutenant had a very friendly conversation with her, during which she expressed regret that her whole life, all the years, had been for nothing. She was originally considered to be a war criminal, but was later reclassified as a collaborator. She was released on May 12, 1948, after nearly 3 years of imprisonment. After the war, Schroeder worked as a secretary for a construction company in Munich. She retired in 1967 and never married. Unlike Johanna Wolf, Schroeder eventually decided to break her silence. Her interrogation and later interviews in 1948 with Albert Zoller formed the basis for the first book published about Hitler after World War II in 1949, titled Hitler Privat, or Hitler in Private. However, Schroeder was deeply unhappy with this publication. She claimed that Zoller had put words in her mouth and included material she had never said. According to her later statements, 68 to 78 pages of Zoller's book were either not said by her or were reworded to give an incorrect slant on what she had said. She wrote letters describing complete fabrications that Zoller had attributed to her. In the early 1980s, Schroeder asked Anton Joachimsthaler, a technical and historical writer she trusted, to help her publish her own account. Her memoir, Er war mein Chef, meaning He Was My Chief, was published in German in 1985, just 1 year after her death. An English translation was published in 2009 under the title He Was My Chief, The Memoirs of Adolf Hitler's Secretary. The book was serialized in the Sunday Telegraph Magazine 7, the Week magazine, and the New York Post newspaper. Christa Schroeder died on June 28, 1984, in Munich at the age of 76. She was cremated at the Ostfriedhof Cemetery, and her urn was later taken home by family. Schroeder's memoir provides fascinating details about Hitler's daily life, his habits, his health deterioration during the war, and the atmosphere within his inner circle. She recalls, for instance, that the relationship between Martin Bormann and his brother Albert, who was on Hitler's personal staff, was so bad that the two would only communicate with one another via their respective adjutants, even if they were in the same room. She describes Hitler's health deterioration during the war, noting that from 1944 onwards, the knowledge that he was no longer master of his own body was a heavy burden. When surprise visitors saw his trembling hand, he would cover it instinctively with the other. Yet to the end, he remained master of his emotions. She also shares how Hitler asked her opinion of his speeches and once told her, "You are the only person I allow to correct me." What's striking about Schroeder's memoir, however, is the absence of remorse or self-reflection that characterizes Traudl Junge's later accounts. Schroeder claims to have known nothing of the horrors of the Nazi regime. There is nothing of the sense of perspective or the mea culpa that one finds in Junge's memoirs, who concluded, "We should have known." Rather, the tone that pervades Schroeder's memoir is one of bitterness. She seems bitter that her life's work came to nothing, bitter about the war's outcome, but not particularly troubled by moral questions about what she had been part of. In her memoir, she recalls how in 1943 Henriette von Schirach, wife of Baldur von Schirach, complained about the treatment of the Jews. Hitler replied, "Be silent, Frau von Schirach. You understand nothing about it. You are sentimental. What does it matter to you what happens to female Jews? Every day, tens of thousands of my most valuable men fall, while the inferior survive." Schroeder records this exchange, but offers no commentary on it, no reflection on what it revealed about Hitler's ideology or her complicity in serving him. Even decades after the war, Schroeder maintained relationships with other surviving members of Hitler's inner circle. She never seemed to fully grasp or accept the magnitude of what the Nazi regime had done, or her own moral responsibility for serving it loyally. Her memoir presents Hitler as a demanding but often pleasant boss, a man with quirks and health problems, without seriously reckoning with his role as architect of genocide. For Schroeder, Hitler remained her chief until the end, and her primary regret seemed to be that Germany lost the war, not that she had devoted 12 years to serving a mass murderer. Gerda Christian, born Gerda Daranowski on December 13, 1913, in Berlin, was nicknamed Dara. She worked for Elizabeth Arden before coming to work for Hitler. In 1937, Hitler's other secretaries, Johanna Wolf and Christa Schroeder, complained about having too much work and asked for assistance. Hitler reportedly hesitated because he did not wish to see a new face in his inner sanctum, but he finally relented and hired Daranowski. She had been engaged to Hitler's driver, Erich Kempka, but on February 2, 1943, she married Luftwaffe officer Eckhard Christian instead. After her marriage, she took a break from her employment for Hitler, and her work was taken over by Traudl Junge. In mid-1943, Gerda Christian returned to Hitler's staff as one of his private secretaries. Her husband was promoted to General Major and Chief of the Luftwaffe Command Staff at Hitler's request on September 1, 1944. In April 1945, Eckhard was stationed in Berlin at the Führerbunker headquarters. He left the bunker complex on April 22, 1945, to become chief of the liaison staff of the Luftwaffe to OKW Command Staff North. This departure would later destroy their marriage. Gerda and Traudl Junge both volunteered to remain with Hitler in the Führerbunker. While in the bunker complex, the women also looked after the Goebbels children. During Hitler's last days in Berlin, he would regularly eat lunch with Junge and Christian. After the war, Junge recalled Christian asking Hitler if he would leave Berlin, which Hitler firmly rejected. Christian recalled that Hitler made it clear in conversation that his body must not fall into the hands of the Soviets. He would shoot himself and wanted to be cremated without a trace. Eva Braun said she would take cyanide poison. At one of these mealtime conversations, Hitler gave Christian a cyanide ampoule for her own use if needed. In the early afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Braun said farewell to members of the Führerbunker staff and fellow occupants, including Bormann, Joseph Goebbels and his family, the secretaries, and several military officers. After the farewells, Christian returned to the secretary quarters located in part of the large cellars under the Reich Chancellery. Later she returned to the Führerbunker and learned from the chief L.A., Heinz Ling, that Hitler was dead and his corpse had been carried upstairs and out into the Chancellery garden, where cremation was still in progress. She walked into Hitler's study and saw a bloodstain about the size of a hand on the rug next to the sofa where Hitler had shot himself. After Hitler's death, Christian tried to escape from Berlin on May 1st, 1945. She was part of a breakout group led by SS Brigadefuhrer Wilhelm Monk, which included secretaries Els Kruger and Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal pilot Hans Bauer, chief of Hitler's bodyguard Hans Rattenhuber, Hitler's dietitian Constanze Manzierli, and physician Ernst Gunther Schenk. The group attempted to flee through the Soviet encirclement of Berlin. Members of the group were taken prisoner by Soviet forces on the morning of May 2nd while hiding in a cellar off the Skanhauser Allee. However, Christian would be among those who escaped Soviet capture initially, only to be captured later by American forces in March 1946. In 1946, Christian divorced her husband Eckhard Christian because he had not remained with her in the Führerbunker until the death of Hitler. This decision reveals much about the psychological state of those who had been in Hitler's inner circle. Gerda Christian felt that her husband had abandoned her and Hitler at the crucial moment, and she could not forgive this perceived betrayal. The fact that she divorced him over this shows how deeply the bonds of loyalty to Hitler had penetrated, even after his death and the revelation of Nazi atrocities. She moved to Dusseldorf, where she worked at the Hotel Eden. She was a friend of Werner Naumann, a former state secretary in the Third Reich's propaganda ministry. In 1953, Naumann was arrested by the British Army and accused of being the leader of a neo-Nazi group, though he was never convicted. This friendship suggests that Christian, like Schroeder, maintained connections with unrepentant former Nazis. Gerda Christian died of cancer in Dusseldorf on April 14, 1997, at the age of 83. Unlike Traudl Junge, who spent her later years speaking publicly about her guilt and complicity, Christian largely remained silent about her experiences. She gave no extensive interviews and wrote no memoirs. She was portrayed by various actresses in film and television productions about Hitler's final days, but she herself never sought to tell her own story publicly. Her life after the war was quiet, working at a hotel, maintaining friendships with other former members of the inner circle, but never engaging in the public reckoning that Junge eventually embraced. Traudl Junge's story stands in stark contrast to the others. Born Gertrude Humps on March 16, 1920, In Munich, she was the youngest of Hitler's secretaries and the one whose post-war journey of moral reckoning would become the most public and influential. Growing up, Junge and her sister Inga wanted to be ballerinas. Though Junge's applications to dance schools were rejected, her sister was talented and moved to Berlin to pursue a dance career. When Junge was 22, she followed her sister to Berlin, excited by the arts and opportunities in the city. Once it became apparent she wouldn't become a dancer, Junge went to school to become a typist. As Hitler rose to power, his need for staff opened up job opportunities for skilled typists, and Junge applied for a position. She was hired as one of several secretaries in Hitler's office in December 1942. In November 1942, Adolf Hitler had two main secretaries, Johanna Wolff and Christa Schroeder. Both had been his secretaries and constant companions for over 10 years, and the stress and strain of such an irregular life had affected their ability to perform well, as had their increasing age. Hitler needed additional help. In December 1942, Hitler selected Traudl to take a dictation test. He took a strong liking to her and told Albert Bormann that he did not need to interview the other candidates. Traudl recalled, "It turned out that Hitler didn't want to try any of the other secretaries because he thought that I had done satisfactorily and was suitable. So 9 girls went back to Berlin next day while I stayed in the Wolf's lair. From then on, except for a few weeks' holiday, there were very few days when I didn't see Hitler, talk to him, work with him, or share meals with him." Traudl admitted, "I was 22 and I didn't know anything about politics. It didn't interest me. I admit, I was fascinated by Adolf Hitler. He was a pleasant boss and a fatherly friend. I deliberately ignored all the warning voices inside me and enjoyed the time by his side almost until the bitter end. It wasn't what he said, but the way he said things and how he did things. This fascination was carefully cultivated by Hitler. At first, it was ordinary secretarial work, transcribing correspondence, assisting with fan mail, managing communication. But as the war dragged on and Hitler's inner circle grew smaller, something shifted. He began inviting Traudl and the other secretaries to dine with him daily. These meals on the surface seemed warm, even familial, but they weren't random acts of kindness. Hitler understood power, and he knew that one of its strongest tools was proximity. As his broader influence began to fray, he used charm to keep control of what he could. Through humor, inclusion, and emotional intimacy, he built loyalty where questions should have lived. Encouraged by Hitler, in June 1943, Traudl married Waffen-SS officer Hans Hermann Junge, who had been a valet and orderly to Hitler. The two were married by a priest. Hitler encouraged the marriage, perhaps even pushed for it. Hans Junge was killed during a low-flying aircraft attack in Dreux, Normandy, on August 13, 1944. Traudl was given the news by Hermann Fegelein, liaison officer of the Waffen-SS. He explained that Adolf Hitler could not bring himself to tell her. The Führer has known since yesterday, but he wanted to wait for confirmation, and then he found he couldn't tell you himself. At age 24, Traudl was a widow. She continued working for Hitler, traveling with him to various headquarters, and eventually following him to the Führer bunker in Berlin for the final act. During Hitler's last days in Berlin, he would regularly eat lunch with his secretaries Junge and Gerda Christian. After the war, Junge recalled Christian asking Hitler if he would leave Berlin, which he firmly rejected. On April 22nd and 23rd, 1945, Hitler dictated his personal will and his political testament to Junge. This would be her final task for him. She typed both documents while the Soviet army closed in on Berlin. In his political testament, Hitler blamed the Jews for the war and urged the German nation to continue the racial struggle. In his personal will, he married Eva Braun and appointed successors to lead what remained of the Nazi state. After typing these documents, Junge remained in the bunker. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Junge was close enough to hear the bitter almond odor of Eva Braun's cyanide pill. On May 1st, Junge left the Führerbunker with a group led by Waffen-SS General Wilhelm Mohnke. Also in the group were Hitler's personal pilot Hans Bauer, chief of Hitler's bodyguard Hans Rattenhuber, secretaries Gerda Christian and Else Kruger, Hitler's dietitian Constanze Manzierli, and physician Ernst Gunther Schenk. The group attempted to break through Soviet lines. Junge, Christian, and Kruger made it out of Berlin to the River Elbe. The remainder of the group was found by Soviet Red Army troops on May 2nd while hiding in a cellar off the Skönhauser Allee. The Soviet troops handed over those who had been in the Führerbunker to SMERSH for interrogation to reveal what had occurred in the bunker during the closing weeks of the war. Although Junge had reached the Elbe, she was unable to reach the Western Allied lines, and so she went back to Berlin. Arriving there about a month after she had left, she had hoped to take a train to the west when they began running again. On June 9th, after living there for about a week under the alias Gerda Alt, she was arrested by 2 civilian members of the Soviet military administration and was kept in Berlin for interrogation. While in prison, she heard harrowing tales from her Soviet guards about what the German military had done to members of their families in the Soviet Union. She came to realize that much of what she thought she knew about the war in the East was only what the Nazi propaganda ministry had told the German people, and that the treatment meted out to Germans by the Soviets was a response to what the Germans had done in the Soviet Union. Junge was held in several jails, where she was often interrogated about her role in Hitler's entourage and the events surrounding Hitler's suicide. By December 1945, she had been released from prison but was restricted to the Soviet sector of Berlin. In Munich in 1947, once the capital of the Nazi movement, the city was in ruins. Traudl Junge was 27 years old and had been a widow for 3 years. Her last employer, as she described him, was dead, and many of her closest colleagues from the war period were missing without trace. She didn't know if they had been taken away to Russian camps or committed suicide. She had survived several months in Russian prisons, a protracted attack of diphtheria, and an adventurous escape from Berlin to Munich. She returned with mixed feelings, afraid of being pilloried or shunned. She did not hide the fact that she was Hitler's private secretary for 2.5 years and was relieved to find how little interest anyone took in her past. Even her mother didn't want to know any more about it. She did often get sensation seekers asking avidly, "Is Hitler really dead?" But no one seemed to want to hear details, let alone attempts of any kind to explain what had happened. Traudl Junge's life split in two in the early post-war years. On one side were the memories weighing down on her of that carefree time in Adolf Hitler's circle and its dramatic finale. She was alone with those memories. On the other side was everyday life among the ruins, with its immediate privations and pleasures. At quite an early stage, indeed as she remembered it directly after the fall of the Third Reich, Junge managed to shake off the magnetic attraction of Hitler. Perhaps that was because while she admired the charming, friendly, and paternal side of his character as she knew it at close quarters, she was always indifferent to the National Socialist regime itself, indeed uninterested in it, and gave no serious thought to its ideology and inhumanities. Her past was an undigested mixture of pleasant personal memories and the dreadful knowledge she had been slowly acquiring bit by bit since the war. In 1947, she did not ask herself the hard questions. She had survived, and with the strength of youth, she literally began casting off her past. She worked in secretarial jobs and for many years served as chief secretary of the editorial staff of the weekly illustrated magazine Quick. Junge twice resided briefly in Australia, where her younger sister lived, although her application for permanent residence was denied owing to her past Nazi association. In 1989, Junge's manuscript about her life throughout the war was published by G.P. Putnam's Sons in New York as part of the book Voices from the Bunker by Pierre Galanti and Eugene Silianoff. But Traudl's real reckoning came later, not from a courtroom, but from within. Not until the middle of the 1960s did Junge gradually and seriously begin to confront her past. The catalyst came in an unexpected way. In 1959, while walking in Munich, she came across a memorial plaque to Sophie Scholl, a member of the White Rose Resistance group who had been executed by the Nazis in 1943. Junge noticed that Sophie Scholl had been born in the same year as her, 1921. Actually, Scholl was born in 1921 and Junge in 1920, but Junge believed they were the same age. This realization shook her profoundly. Here was someone her own age who had recognized the evil of the Nazi regime and had actively resisted it, paying with her life. Meanwhile, Junge had spent those same years typing Hitler's correspondence and eating lunch with him. The memorial plaque made Junge realize that being young was no excuse, that ignorance was no excuse. She later said, "At that moment, I really realized that being young is no excuse, and that it might have been possible to find things out." From that point forward, the questions began to torment her. She started to confront the uncomfortable truths about her own complicity. She acknowledged that she had enjoyed working for Hitler almost to the bitter end. She admitted that she had been fascinated by him and had deliberately ignored warning voices. But unlike Christa Schroeder or Johanna Wolf, Junge did not stop at acknowledgement. She took the next, harder step, accepting responsibility and expressing genuine remorse. She later wrote, "I have learned to admit that I enjoyed working for him almost to the bitter end. And most powerfully, I felt great guilt for liking the greatest criminal ever to have lived." In 2002, in the final months of her life, Junge participated in the documentary Blind Spot, Hitler's Secretary, directed by Andre Heller and Othmar Schmitterer. She shared her memories not to excuse herself, but to warn others. The documentary presents an elderly woman, speaking directly to the camera, confronting her past with brutal honesty. She doesn't try to minimize Hitler's charm or her own fascination with him. She doesn't claim she didn't know, though she admits she chose not to know. The documentary is powerful precisely because Junge doesn't position herself as a victim. She positions herself as someone who made choices, wrong choices, and who must live with those choices. Shortly after the documentary was filmed, Junge's memoir, Until the Final Hour, was published in German in 2002 and in English in 2003. The memoir, which she had actually written shortly after the war in 1947, but set aside for decades, offers a unique and chilling glimpse of the human face of a man known to posterity as a monster. Junge observed the intimate workings of Hitler's administration. She typed correspondence and speeches, including Hitler's public and private last will and testament. She ate her meals and spent evenings with him. She was close enough to hear the bomb that was intended to assassinate Hitler in the Wolf's Lair in 1944. She was close enough to smell the bitter almond odor of Eva Braun's cyanide pill in 1945. Her memoir became a part of several dramatizations, most notably the 2004 German film Downfall, Der Untergang, about Hitler's final 10 days. The film opens and closes with footage from Blind Spot, showing the real Traudl Junge reflecting on her life. These bookends frame the dramatization with the voice of someone who is actually there, someone who understands the weight of what happened. In the opening, she says, "Now that I've let it out, I feel better. I can see that it was no excuse that I was so young. There would have been the chance to find out about things." In the closing, filmed shortly before her death, she reflects more deeply on her guilt and responsibility. Traudl Junge died on February 10th, 2002, in Munich at the age of 81, shortly after the publication of the German edition of her book and the completion of the documentary. Her death came just as her story was reaching a wider audience than ever before. The publication of her memoir and the documentary sparked renewed discussion about complicity, responsibility, and the nature of evil. Junge's willingness to confront her past publicly made her story qualitatively different from the other secretaries. While Wolff maintained silence, Schroeder expressed bitterness, and Christian kept quiet. Junge chose the hardest path: public reckoning and genuine moral reflection. The question that haunts all these stories is, what did they know? This question has been debated endlessly by historians and the public. All four secretaries claimed, at various points, not to have known about the Holocaust, about the concentration camps, about the systematic murder of millions. Is this credible? The evidence suggests a more complex picture than simple yes or no answers. It's likely true that the secretaries didn't see systematic documentation of genocide crossing their desks. Hitler was careful about what was put in writing regarding the final solution. The Wannsee Conference protocols, for example, used euphemistic language. Orders for mass murder were often given verbally. The secretaries were not involved in policy discussions or military planning beyond their administrative roles. However, it's also clear that they had many opportunities to know, or at least to suspect, that something terrible was happening. The Nazi regime's anti-Semitism was never secret. Hitler's speeches, which the secretaries typed and heard repeatedly, were filled with violent rhetoric about Jews. The Nuremberg laws, the Kristallnacht pogrom, the deportations, these were public events. By 1942, when Traudl Junge joined Hitler's staff, millions of Jews had already been murdered. Rumors about mass killings circulated throughout Germany. The secretaries traveled with Hitler to various headquarters, including locations in occupied territories. They interacted with SS officers and other officials who were directly involved in atrocities. Perhaps most tellingly, in her memoir, Christa Schroeder records an exchange where Henriette von Schirach complained to Hitler about the treatment of Jews, and Hitler responded with a vicious dismissal of Jewish lives. This conversation happened in the presence of the secretaries, yet Schroeder claims not to have understood its significance at the time. The truth appears to be that the secretaries engaged in what psychologists call willful ignorance or motivated blindness. They had enough information to know that something terrible was happening, but they chose not to pursue that knowledge. They chose to focus on the pleasant aspects of their work, the proximity to power, the sense of being important. They chose to believe Hitler's fatherly persona and ignore the mounting evidence of his monstrous crimes. This is perhaps most clearly articulated by Traudl Junge herself, when she said, "I deliberately ignored all the warning voices inside me." She admits that the voices were there. She admits that she chose not to listen. This honest admission is what separates her later reflections from the denials of the others. The varying responses of Hitler's secretaries to their past also reflect broader patterns in post-war German society. In the immediate aftermath of the war, most Germans were focused on survival. The country was in ruins. Millions were displaced or dead. Food was scarce, and the future was uncertain. There was little appetite for deep moral reckoning. Many Germans, like the secretaries, claimed they didn't know about Nazi atrocities or positioned themselves as victims of Hitler rather than participants in his regime. This began to change in the 1960s. A younger generation began asking harder questions of their parents and grandparents. The Eichmann trial in 1961, broadcast worldwide, brought Holocaust testimony into public consciousness. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965 forced Germans to confront the systematic nature of the genocide. It was during this period that Traudl Junge began her own reckoning after seeing the Sophie Scholl Memorial Plaque. By the 1980s and 1990s, a more honest confrontation with the Nazi past had become possible in Germany. The publication of Christa Schroeder's memoir in 1985 and its English translation in 2009 contributed to this ongoing process, even though Schroeder herself never fully embraced the moral implications of her service to Hitler. The 2002 documentary about Traudl Junge and the 2004 film downfall sparked intense debate in Germany about how to remember and represent the Nazi period. Some critics argued that humanizing Hitler by showing his daily life risked normalizing him. Others argued that understanding how ordinary people could serve evil was essential.